Flower is the subject of a chapter in Jerome Groopman's book on hope, The Anatomy of Hope. And in it, he describes, Groopman is a prominent Harvard oncologist, that there's a patient of his with esophageal cancer. And they've done everything for her, and he's seeing her in follow-up, and he realizes that, again, from a statistical point of view, she won't be back for the next annual follow-up. Now, she has a hobby. She's a botanist. She loves her garden. And she says, you know what, Professor Groopman, I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to plant this specific flower, which takes a year to germinate and blossom. And I'm going to schedule a follow-up appointment for 12 months from now, and at that time, I expect to present you with this flower. And in fact, she does. That's a story. In academic medicine, even though I don't completely agree with this, we have a tendency to reject anecdotes. Instead, we want data. We want to see whether principles are applicable to large bodies of patients. And as Professor Feldman said earlier today, it's actually very difficult to study the impact of the things we're talking about today, especially among a group of oncology patients. Colleagues in Australia about 15 years ago had a great idea of combining chemotherapy and radiation, and they wanted to see if this could be the magic bullet for lung cancer. And it turned out it wasn't, but simultaneously, they actually coded the patients at entry into the trial for optimism. They said, could it be that the more optimistic patients have a better outcome? And if you're used to reading these curves, you see that all of these akumot are superimposable. In other words, it didn't matter. I'm not even going to translate for you what an optimism score of 3 or 5 is. It didn't matter. The outcome was the same. So is this the last slide of our talk? No, for several reasons. First of all, the classic metaphor of the glass half full versus half empty is, I would submit, more the metaphor of optimism versus hope, because they're not really synonymous. The optimistic person would actually not only see the glass half full, that person would see the glass half full with cherry soda, with petal. And you know these people. Maybe you are one of these people. Maybe you like these people. Maybe it's hard for you to get along with these people. Depends on you. But the bottom line is, more or less, optimism is sometimes pathological, but always it's congenital. It's something you sort of either have or you don't, as opposed to the construct that Dave Feldman was describing before of hope, for which we can have some impact. Now, it's true in the literature these days, we switch around between state hope and trait hope, that maybe trait hope is more optimism, but I do want to make that distinction, that it's a little dangerous to assume that there are synonyms involved here. And as we heard, in the oncologic literature, we don't see a lot of information on hopefulness. And for this reason, I've become extremely interested in it in the latter years of my career, the last 2 or 3 years, and have the great fortune of now working with both Malka and Dave. This article here, which is pretty much the most heavily cited article on oncology and hope, was published also in 2003, 15 years ago. And this, more or less, is kind of where we're holding. And it's a very interesting idea. It's something you might have said to a patient or to a friend who was going through some particular stress. You would say, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. This is really sound advice. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, in the article itself, there are 9 different principles which help us to apply this notion of hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. And I want to give you an example of that. I want to spend 2 minutes on that with something I recently uncovered. This is a famous picture from Neil Armstrong's first walk on the moon. On the 30th anniversary of the walk on the moon, in other words, the walk on the moon was in 1969, this occurred in 1999, there was declassification of information. And it turned out that there was an uncertainty. No one was sure, since no one had done it, whether this was going to be a successful mission. And for that reason, an alternative speech was written for President Nixon. So I'm going to play for you right now, if the technology works, the interview that was done with Bill Safar, the New York Times columnist who was Nixon's chief speechwriter, and he's going to speak about that for 1.5 minutes. And it's very interesting what he has to say, if I can get it to work.
Tendency now to just assume that the moonshot, Apollo 11, was an enormous technical feat that exhibited great hope for mankind. I remember when Frank Borman, who astronaut who acted as a liaison with the White House, called me up and said, you're working on this moonshot. You want to consider a alternative posture for the president in the event of mishaps. And that was, as far as I was concerned, gobbledygook, and I didn't get it until he added, and I can hear him now, like what to do for the widows. Because at that time, the most important, the most dangerous part of the moon mission was to get that lunar module back up into orbit around the moon and to join the command ship. But if they couldn't, and it was a good risk that they couldn't, then they would have to be abandoned on the moon, left to die there. And mission control would then have to use their euphemism, close down communication. And the men would have to either starve to death or commit suicide. And so we prepared for that with a speech that
It's actually a very good place to stop.
I wrote.
I'll go on to the next one. Before we do this, I want to read you, the whole speech was 4 sentences. This is what President Nixon would have said if that didn't work out. He would have said, fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men know that there is no hope for their recovery, but they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. In their exploration, they stir the people of the world to feel as one. In their sacrifice, they bind more tightly the brotherhood of man. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. Now we, living in a country where one of our great national heroes is Ilan Ramon, unfortunately are intimately aware of this, and many of you could have sensed where I was going with that particular slide. But the idea here that I want to emphasize is twofold. One, that we really do need to prepare for the worst. I don't minimize that at all. But embedded in the speech is a lot of, I think, what Dave Feldman was talking about, almost as the powerlessness of hope, almost the romantic side of hope. Like, what do you do with that? And unfortunately, this is a place that we are in our society. And I want to put that in context for you, because in the world I occupy as a professional, dealing with cancer patients and with the healthcare providers, it becomes very difficult to speak about something like hope, because there is a much more abstract understanding of it as opposed to a pragmatic and functional understanding of it. I'm going to skip a lot of slides, including that one which had the definition on it, but I do want to emphasize or put a gauge on several things that Dave said. First of all, the idea of a goal, and these are Snyder's original stick figures. The idea of a goal is in fact needs to be a plausible goal. And the example I always like to use is, I would love to be an NBA basketball player, like Omri Caspi. Unfortunately, and for many reasons, that will not happen. This is not a plausible goal for me. Pathways we talked about extensively, and the idea of agency, and I think the last speaker also echoed this extremely well, the idea that someone who has this motivation is not naive, realizes there are obstacles along the way, but needs to be able to deal with that reality. And the word agency always preoccupied me when I first read it in Snyder's writing, until I thought, if you saw this movie. So this character, who was based on Ari Emanuel, is the agent. It's based on the brother of Rahm Emanuel and Ezekiel Emanuel. And if you know the movie, you know that this is a person who will stop at nothing to do things on behalf of his clients and himself. He has tremendous agency. He's an agent. So on the one hand, we talked about the reality that, at least in my world, day in, day out, at Shaarei Tzedek, before that at Ifilov, hope is very abstract. But there's another end of the spectrum, and that is where hope is very focused, too narrow. And that is, we as clinicians tend to create an equation in oncology, which is to say that hope equals cure. We conflate hope with cure. And this has tremendous ramifications. First of all, a practical reason is, you're not going to believe this, but oncologists have Dave talked about the multiple definitions of hope. There are multiple definitions for cure. And this is one of the reasons why, if you're an oncology patient, or if you are a milaveh, a caregiver to an oncology patient, the odds are you never heard your doctor, even 10 years or 20 years after the diagnosis, use the word cure. Now that's a tragedy, by the way. It's a terrible tragedy, and it was addressed this year at the main meeting by the new head of the National Cancer Institute. And this is an article that appeared in the Journal of Cancer Education, which showed that a patient almost never feels empowered to call themselves a survivor because the doctor doesn't know what to say. And I could go through all the technicalities of whether we're talking about a so-called tail on the survival curve, or whether we're talking about age and gender matched cohorts who have equal survival curves. We don't really know what language to speak. And this is a terrible, terrible problem, you can imagine, if you're limiting the definition of hope to a definition of cure. Because then that would mean you never get to really be hopeful. And this, in fact, is a study that we recently completed and we're writing up right now. And this study, and this also talks about the amazing times that we live in. So I mentioned before that at the last major cancer meeting, which was in Chicago 3 months ago, the new head of the National Cancer Institute, in his speech, said, we're not using the word cure enough, we have to do something about that. And of course, he has an agenda because he's from the NCI, so he wants to say they're more successful. But it was, there's the issue of 6 degrees of separation, and in Israel, it's about 1.5 degrees, because I always say it's not a country, it's a neighborhood, so you can get to anybody. So I had a friend who basically said, you want to speak to the head of the National Cancer Institute? Here's his email. I sent him an email, and I said, you said we're not using the word cure enough. I agree with you, and I think we're also not using the word hope enough. So we did the following study that I want to tell you about, because I think the data are fascinating. The journal in cancer medicine with the so-called highest impact factor, the one that's read and quoted by most of us and most of you, whether it's the New York Times or Haaretz, is called the JCO, the Journal of Clinical Oncology. 20 years ago, they launched a section called AOO, the Art of Oncology. It is a narrative section. One of the slides before had Professor Niemeyer. So it's encouraging physicians and patients to write stories related to cancer medicine and the cancer experience. Okay? There are, of course, original reports, the ones with the hardcore data. And then there's something which, if this is a scale of fluffiness, which is sort of intermediate, and that's the editorial, where the expert in the field puts the primary data in perspective for us and gives us his or her vision about where this is all going. So you have very hardcore scientific, you have very fluffy narrative, and you have in the middle the editorial. In 20 years, 300 narrative pieces, over 10,000 original articles, and 1,700 editorials. And what do you see? You see this incredible trend that in terms of cure, we're very hesitant to use it until we get to the less scientific, where we're not so afraid to use it, where we're just pontificating. And even more dramatic in hope. In primary articles, the term hope is only used 8% of the time in the last 20 years in the top oncology journal, whereas in the narrative work, it's used more than half the time. Now this is remarkable, and it's only going to be remarkable if you'll buy my premise that that equation exists, that hope equals cure. So what did we do? The head of the NCI, when I proposed this idea to him, his name is Ned Sharpless, he said, you might not be aware of this, but there's a new science right now called clinical informatics. And he introduced me to somebody who's jointly on their staff at the University of Florida, Gainesville. And within a couple of months, we did this analysis. And then we also did something else. We created what are called word clouds on the same database. So this might look like, if you've ever traveled in, I'm from New York, the New York City subways, and you see the graffiti on the wall, it might kind of look like that, and just this verbal chaos. But I'm here to tell you that this is highly quantitative data, because what you're seeing here are probability distributions. So as an example, we know that when people speak or write, they often will make an association between things like cancer and smoking and tobacco. So that's certainly one that you can buy. We've spoken about the idea of caregiving, and you can imagine how there are associations with spouses or partners and coping. But here's the one that to me was most interesting. Look at this word cloud. You have hope here. We did a word cloud looking for hope. And again, what is it connected with? It's connected with terms about survival and medians. This is the way, and there's some tail here where it's not exclusively that, but this is the way clinicians in oncology are looking at hope. It has nothing to do with the model that was articulated by Dave Feldman about 3 hours ago. And that's a problem. I'm going to show you another video now that about half of the room has seen already, but I want to make a point with it. If you can, and I know you know it, try and refrain when you see the punchline, but I know it's difficult. But I want to make a point.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
Sorry.
How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks, training, and teaching on DVDs from VizCog Productions. Learn more at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
Okay, so a couple of points. First of all, I did not get permission from VizCog Productions to show that to you. Secondly, is I forgot this is an audience of a lot of psychologists, so probably 80% of you had seen that. But the point I want to make is that in oncology, in the world of clinical medicine, very often, just like in real life, we're distracted. We have our, as we say, eyes on the prize, and in that case it's cure. But there are other things that we need to think about in the world of cancer medicine. Like, as Dave said, how a patient copes, what is the quality of life, is a patient complying with what the doctor wants him or her to do, and I believe that hopefulness can have a big impact on that issue. When it comes to goals and the idea of defining new goals, as Dave was speaking about, so-called re-goaling, an outstanding example, which is a lay book that comes from the world of medicine, is this one. And if you hadn't read it, you